Welcome to the Steel City. Is everybody ready to go? Let's proclaim the greatest radio show.
Welcome, fans, to the final fantasy football episode of the year. I'm your host, Jim Sella, here with Jay Dash. If you're playing fantasy football in week 17, you're beat. Your league's garbage because everybody rests all their players and you have to drop half your team.
Believe it. Hopefully your championship was in week 16, but if you do play 17, we aren't going to leave you hanging. We are going to do this segment, but hopefully you learned a lesson this season. There's a lot of good players sitting, and that's not what you want in fantasy football. So next season, stop in week 16, but we will do the week 17 segment next season probably as well.
Garbage. What do we got?
Yeah, situational starters we'll start off with here. They've averaged 13.84 points per player on the season. The quarterbacks averaged 21.2 points per quarterback, and we are taking one this week. We got Blake Bortles going into Indy. They led up the 10th most fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. He's coming off of one of his best games of the season, 325 yards and a touchdown versus Tennessee. He also caught a touchdown from Marcus Lee. He had 31 fantasy points in week 4 versus Indy as well, had 2 TD passes in that game. And if you actually look, he has 8 touchdowns and 2 interceptions against his own division this season. So he does play well within the division. And 2 of his 4 300-yard games have come within the division as well. We have Michael Thomas, wide receiver for the New Orleans Saints, going into Atlanta. They led up the 8th most fantasy points to wide receivers this season. He has 18 targets over the last 2 games, 13 catches and 150 yards with a touchdown in that span. And if you look back in week 3 against Atlanta, 7 catches on 11 targets, 71 yards and a touchdown. This guy leads all rookies in receptions, yards, and touchdowns. He has 82 catches for 981 yards and 8 touchdowns on a season. So big rookie year for Michael Thomas. And if you look back in that Atlanta game in week 3, the final score of that matchup was 45-32. So high scoring game. You could see that again this week. The defenses for both these teams aren't that great. So Michael Thomas has a good chance to come up with a big game. And the last one, if he gets enough playing time, D'Angelo Williams versus Cleveland. They led up the 2nd most fantasy points to running backs this season. He's had 9 carries since Bell returned in week 4, though. So he's been hurt, but even when he was healthy, he doesn't get much playing time when Bell plays. But Bell is not playing in this game. D'Angelo, he was supposed to return last week, but he didn't see any game action. He was active, but I'd pick up Williams if he's out there, if you need a running back, and I'd pick up Fitzgerald Toussaint, just in case D'Angelo Williams doesn't play. If Toussaint was the guy they gave the ball to, I still think he could have a solid game against Cleveland.
If he doesn't drop every ball he gets.
Believe it. So who you saying?
I'm going to go with Blake Bortles just because Indy's defense has been god-awful this year, especially against the pass. Bortles, he was a guy I thought this year would really take a step forward and blow up. So, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if he had a really good game. I actually, would normally expect him to have a good game, although this season hasn't worked out that well for him. But I think he can end the season strong. He wants to show this organization that he deserves to be there, and he wants to show whoever's the coach next year that he should be the starter.
All right, let's move on to sleepers. Our non-quarterbacks average 12.19 points per player. We have a running back and 2 receivers here. We'll start with the running back. That is Jerick McKinnon versus Chicago. They led up the 16th most fantasy points to running backs. He has 5 straight games with double-digit fantasy points now, and he's been used more and more in the passing game over the final third of the season, really. He's had at least 5 receptions in each of his last 4 games. And look at this. The Bears have allowed 7 rushing TDs in their last 2 games. So Jerick McKinnon is a solid play. We know Adrian Peterson came back. He played 1 game. They sat him last week. I don't believe he's going to play this week, and even if he does, he's not going to get a huge workload or anything. And then we have another Minnesota Viking, a wide receiver, Adam Thielen. What he did last week was huge. Again, going up against Chicago, they led up the 17th most fantasy points to wide receivers. Last week, a career game for him at Green Bay, 12 catches on 15 targets, 202 yards and 2 touchdowns. He has double-digit fantasy points in 7 of his last 8 games, and the one game that he didn't have double digits was the game.
It's the one game that I started him.
Exactly. He was knocked out hard early in that game. And
Lock at, dude.
And he ended up with 0 points in that game. It wasn't his fault, man. It was almost a great catch, too. He actually caught it, and when he got hit, he fell to the ground and he was knocked out, so the ball just like rolled off of him. You know what I mean? If hit a
Pansy.
yeah, pansy. But he's really turned into Bradford's favorite target out there in Minnesota, and I think against Chicago he can come up with another good game.
Did you know Bradford could break Drew Brees' completion percentage record this year?
I believe it because Sam Bradford is a check down
machine.
Check down machine. There you go. And the last receiver, Dontrell Inman for San Diego, going up against KC. They led up the 10th most fantasy points to wide receivers this season. He had his most targets since week 4 last week with 10, although he didn't come up with that great of a game versus Cleveland. It was actually his second single-digit fantasy performance over his last 8 games. However, you look 54 targets in his last 7 games, and this is a game that KC should win, so San Diego should be behind in this game, and they're going to have to pass when they're behind. Melvin Gordon isn't healthy right now. They don't have much of a run game out there, and KC gets beat by the slot receiver, and that's where Dontrell Inman runs a lot of his routes from, so Inman could come up with a solid game here.
I'm going to go with Inman just because I want San Diego to beat Kansas City because I don't want Pittsburgh to have to go to Arrowhead Stadium and play that team. It'd be a tough football game for the Steelers to win in the playoffs. I have no basis other than that to pick Inman because it's week 17 and you shouldn't even be playing.
Please believe it. All right, let's move on to deep sleepers then. 10.8 points per non-quarterback. And let's see, do we have a quarterback? No, we don't. We have a running back, a wide receiver, and a tight end. We're going to start off with running back for the Baltimore Ravens, Kenneth Dixon, going into Cincinnati. They led up the 11th most fantasy points to running backs this season. He actually had a season-high 13 carries the last time they faced Cincinnati. He ended up with 11 fantasy points in that game. He had 49 yards rushing plus four receptions for 31 yards in the passing game in that matchup. He had a season high in rushing yards last week versus a pretty good defense in the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now that was without Stephon Tuitt, I know, but it's still a pretty good run defense. He ended up with a season high 57 yards in that game. And he's just a rookie still, so this is a game Baltimore really has nothing to play for at this point. They just want to see what they have going in the next season. Kenneth Dixon is probably a guy they're going to give more carries to this week to see if he's worth a shot at their starting running back next season.
Dude's beat.
We have Anquan Bolden for the Detroit Lions going up against Green Bay. Green Bay actually lets up the most fantasy points to wide receivers this season now. Anquan Bolden hasn't gone more than 2 weeks without a TD all season, and guess what? He hasn't scored in his past 2 games. He actually has 4 of his 7 TDs against his own division this season as well, including one last time that he faced Green Bay. He scored a TD in each of his last 3 division games. He has 6 or more targets in 5 of his last 6 games, and the last time these 2 teams played, it was a high-scoring game, 34-27. I don't expect it to be that high-scoring again, but Anquan Bolden, he's been inconsistent this season, but when he has a couple down games, he does bounce back, and this should be a bounce-back game for him. And the last guy, a tight end, a deep sleeper here, comatose. So Vernon Davis going up against the New York Giants. They led up the 14th most fantasy points to tight ends this season. Jordan Reed isn't going to play in this game, it looks like. The numbers weren't there last week for Vernon Davis with Jordan Reed out, but he has done a pretty solid job when Reed was out this season. He's actually had a stretch earlier this year where he's had 5 double-digit fantasy efforts in 6 games between week 6 and week 12. The Giants, you mentioned they are going to play to win this game, but they really don't have too much to play for. So if they do limit some players on defense, that would only help. But even if not, I think Vernon Davis can come up with a solid game. Who are you saying?
I'm not picking any of them.
None of them.
Nah, we'll go with Vernon Davis against the Giants. Somehow losers tend to play well in Washington. Just ask Kirk Cousins.
Ooh, that's tough.
Burn.
I like Jamison Crowder and I like Jordan Reed. Everybody else out there I don't care about.
Yeah. Reed's 1 hit away from the end of his career.
Yeah, he is. Might come to Pittsburgh and...
I was going to say him and Ladarius Green can get an apartment together.
Believe it. But that's it, man.
That's it. That's all we got for the last fantasy episode of the year. I hope all you fans had a great time listening to us. I hope you all won your fantasy leagues, even though that's not possible because only one person can win each league. Other than that, hit us up on Twitter at bet_the_spread. Hit me up on Twitter at betjimthewin. Check out our Facebook page at facebook.com/betthespread. Come back to YouTube, click subscribe. Next year, keep a lookout. We might be doing fantasy podcasts. We might be doing fantasy articles to make it a little easier for you guys to get your information a little quicker. So just keep a lookout. We'll let you know what's going on. Until then, peace.